There has been a countless amount of hated cards in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, but none of them come close to comparison of Maxx. Maxx is easily one of the most hated cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh, but you would be surprised to find out that that wasn't always the case, and in fact, Maxx at point in time was actually a useless card in the game. In today's video, big dog, I'm going to be breaking down why everyone hates Maxx. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Maxx was first released on February 8th, 2011 in a set called Storm of Ragnarok. Now, Storm of Ragnarok is a really weird Yu-Gi-Oh set, and it's mainly because a lot of the cards inside of this set were flops. Between the Nordic Beast monsters, which saw little success, the Scrap monsters, which weren't competitive until a lot later, and the Watt monsters, which also didn't really do anything in the competitive scene, this set could be largely thought of as a complete flop. I actually do remember going to this sneak peek and players were excited for the 6 Samurai cards. Maxx wasn't even on players' radars because at this point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh, special summoning wasn't really that much. If you actually allow me to rewind it back, this was a really weird era of Yu-Gi-Oh. I want to take you back to 3 months ago in the Star Strike format, and you'll start to get a better picture on how Maxx was perceived on its initial release. At the current time, the best decks in the Star Strike Blast format were still decks like Plant Synchro and Blackwing, and even though I would say it's a flop in Storm of Ragnarok, Scraps are still a pretty decent contender. You would think that in this format, Maxx would be a powerful card that you can use against these strategies to be able to secure so much advantage. But if I'm being frank, the best deck in this format was Gravekeepers, and it was by a mile. Gravekeepers just recently got a card called Gravekeepers Recruiter, which allowed them to be able to search Gravekeepers Descendant. Both of these monsters could easily be special summoned through Gravekeepers Spy, and Gravekeepers Commandant can search Necro Valley, which would not only shut down those graveyard reliant decks like Plant Synchro, but also give Gravekeeper monsters a huge boost. 2000 attack level 4 monsters was really hard to deal with at that time. Now, there were other good decks at the time like X-Saber and Frog Monarch, but if you start to notice a trend with these particular decks, they special summon in bursts. None of these strategies would special summon enough times to make Maxx considerably worth it. In fact, against decks like Gravekeepers and Frog Monarch, Maxx would be absolutely terrible against these strategies, and with Gravekeepers being the best deck, Maxx is almost a non-factor. So if you fast forward back into Storm of Ragnarok's release, you can kind of understand why players were not really checking for Maxx. In fact, during the time of release, Maxx was around a $20 Yu-Gi-Oh card, if even that. I remember picking up copies of Maxx just because players were almost giving them away. In fact, if I remember correctly, I traded my rare copies of Gravekeepers Recruiters for 3 copies of Secret Rare Maxx. Those were the good old days. And you're probably looking at me like I ripped that person off, but at the time, Gravekeepers Recruiter was a crazy expensive card, and Maxx was a throwaway. Fortunately, for the people that actually did invest into Maxx, dividends paid off. There was in fact one more archetype inside of Storm of Ragnarok that would change the entire course of Yu-Gi-Oh! Giving an upgrade to the 6 Samurai monsters, the legendary 6 Samurai monsters are introduced here. The legendary 6 Samurai monsters are built to be able to complement the 6 Samurai monsters, giving you different abilities ranging from special summoning monsters to your side of the field, to controlling the board and destroying other cards on the field as well. This support is complemented by its boss monster, legendary 6 Samurai Shien, which can negate spell and trap cards on the side of the field. At this point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh, this is huge. When you combine these newer monsters with an older spell card named Gateway of the Six from Stardust Overdrive, you actually get a 6 Samurai deck that can be incredibly explosive, highly searchable, but more importantly, can summon multiple strong monsters like legendary 6 Samurai Shien into your side of the field, which can be catastrophic. Now, of course, I would love to talk about how 6 Samurais completely dominated a Yu-Gi-Oh era. It actually did it twice. And if that's something that you guys want to see, go ahead and let me know down below in the comment section. But this is a video talking about how Maxx completely changed the game and why everyone hates Maxx. 6 Samurai becomes the very first introduction to what it's like to experience a strategy that can special summon almost endlessly. With other strategies like Plant Synchro and Karakiri on the rise, players are struggling to find a solution to these special summon heavy based Yu-Gi-Oh strategies. It actually gets to a point in time where it feels completely helpless going second if you were playing against a strategy with the correct combo. If a deck were allowed to do whatever it wanted, the special summon heavy base strategies would oftentimes summon more powerful monsters than some of the other decks can keep up with. And with Effect Veiler being the only means to be able to stop a particular player, it became incredibly hard for some of these strategies to be able to keep up. Players were getting more and more desperate to be able to address this situation, but things seemed to be solved when Billy Break actually popularizes Maxx in 2011 at YCS Charlotte. That's right, big dogs. The exact same Billy Break that you would see on Konami streams is actually a multiple-time Shonen Jump champion in Yu-Gi-Oh! He's also a bit of a playmaker and a revolutionary to the game. There should be a video dedicated just to him. Not to say that there weren't other amazing players in the game at the time, but in fact, if a player was so good at the game, he could actually influence the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game just by saying things or playing certain cards. And that's exactly what happened with Maxx. You see, Billy was on to something with Maxx, a card that can be used to be able to counter those special summon heavy decks. And the thought process is pretty simple. If you draw Maxx against a special summon heavy deck, you use it. It would allow you to be able to get enough resources to continue to play the game. It's kind of similar to how Maxx is being used in the OCG in Master Duel, but there's a little wrinkle that we don't currently have in the game. Maxx is actually not a good card against most of the decks during this time in Yu-Gi-Oh! In fact, Maxx fulfills a very specific niche. It addresses Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies that special summon way too much. And it's a card that can't be effectively strong overall because not every deck special summons en masse. And this theory about Maxx actually proves to be true for quite some time. In fact, Maxx was only considered at best a side deck Yu-Gi-Oh! Card simply because of the variance between Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies. There were actually even times where Maxx was considered just straight up a bad card because a lot of the decks that were being played did not justify a Maxx interaction, which would only net you 1 to 2 cards at best. After the Six Samurai problem and Gateway of the Six was eventually addressed, Maxx goes back to being an okay card. It wasn't until later Maxx becomes a really good card again when the Wind-Up and eventually the Insector strategies were released. Two other Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies that special summon a lot, and one of the deck's biggest tactics was getting rid of your opponent's entire hand before they can play the game. Well, not necessarily the entire hand, you would be left with 2 cards, but back then, that is nowhere near enough cards to be able to play the game. At this point in time, Maxx was not the problematic card. In fact, decks like Insectors and Wind-Up were very much the problem, special summoning en masse. And that was pretty much proved because Maxx did take a backseat once those decks were eventually hit and pretty much remained dormant for quite some time. It wasn't a card that was regarded as terrible, but at the same time, it wasn't a card that was mandatorily played in your deck. If anything, Maxx just determined what type of Yu-Gi-Oh! Format it was. A lot of players could probably describe Yu-Gi-Oh! In a bad spot if Maxx became a must-play card, but if the card was okay to bad, then it was probably a really good format, which is why we have formats with Maxx in it, but still not being a dominant card like the Tengu Plant format. Tengu Plant is probably one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats of all time and just doesn't get the recognition. It has just about every single one of the most powerful cards from Edison format, plus all of the synchros and a little bit of Xyz. While also in this format still having Maxx, and if you played this format long enough, you realize that it's not that great of a card. So when does Maxx actually become a problem, and when does everyone start to hate Maxx? Well, Maxx starts to get its hated name almost 2 years later in Abyss Rising. The Mermail strategy starts to come out, and this deck has always been a combo-heavy Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Players start to ready their strategies to be able to combat that, but then Fire Fist are also quickly introduced. In fact, the Fire Water format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Marks a new era of Yu-Gi-Oh! You see, Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies can no longer be like Gravekeepers or Agents to be able to compete. Decks that could special summon but do it at their own tempo. Just about every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategy in the game needs to be able to special summon a few times to compete. Now, this still wasn't really an incredibly terrible time, but a few months later, on May 17, 2013, Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy takes what we thought would be heavy special summoning and puts it on a 10 with the new Dragon Ruler monsters. The Dragon Ruler monsters easily become the mark of what is to happen with Yu-Gi-Oh!, forcing players to keep up with multiple effects that happen during that turn, as well as being a special summon heavy deck. And then pretty much from there on out, Maxx became became a must-play card simply because even after Dragon Rulers were hit, the strategies to be able to keep up with the game had to maintain that type of power creep. And just like that, Maxx became a card to actually help balance against special summon heavy decks into a card that was used in every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck because it provided so much advantage. And as Konami hit strategies made new ones to keep up with the power creep, Maxx stayed relatively the same in its card effects, making it only a stronger card. So why exactly does everyone hate Maxx? To be honest with you guys, I think that Maxx hate could be ill misplaced. Yes, in current modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, Maxx does create a few unpleasant situations. Having a player use Maxx on you when you're playing a modern Yu-Gi-Oh deck means that in order to play Yu-Gi-Oh, you're going to give them a ton of resources, and oftentimes those resources can cost you the game. And while that may have been the initial design with Maxx, the other big problem looms is that because every single Yu-Gi-Oh deck has been modernized and special summons a whole lot, dealing with an opponent that already has an established board and getting Maxx'd when you didn't get the Maxx your opponent could be catastrophic. Which is why, as of recently, Konami has created the Charmy cards, monsters that can only be activated while you control no cards and only allow you to draw cards when your opponent performs a certain special summon action, also requiring the player that used the Charmy cards to shuffle back in cards inside of their deck if the cards in their hand exceed 6 more cards than your opponent has on the field. These are easily some of the most fair modern versions of Maxx in the game. Now, as Yu-Gi-Oh got faster and faster past Xseeds, I made a video talking about how pendulums ruined Yu-Gi-Oh. Konami actually did try to make steps by semi-limiting Maxx to 2 in 2016. Towards the end of the pendulum era, it was limited in 2017 and then eventually banned in February 2018, roughly around the time where Link monsters would be introduced. Maxx is simply one of the most polarizing cards in Yu-Gi-Oh. There may not be many, but there are players that absolutely enjoy it in Master Duel and the OCG. Players can generally agree that while Maxx was a godsend when it first came out, it became one of the most poorly designed cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and that is why so many players hate it.